The dark fate of painkiller addict Maven Huffman is a documented case of corporate medical exploitation. Rushed onto WWE television without proper physical conditioning, the reality TV winner sustained severe injuries. To keep his job and income, he became dependent on heavy painkillers. Management deliberately ignored his severe addiction to keep their television asset working. Once his body broke down entirely, executives terminated his contract and stripped his medical insurance. Left to feed an industry-mandated addiction, Huffman was arrested in 2012 for prescription fraud. This is the factual reality of how the wrestling industry discards chemically compromised athletes. In the spring of 2001, the economic architecture of American broadcast television underwent a severe mutation, bypassing the traditional reliance on unionized actors or scripted dramas. The industry discovered its highest profit margins within the unregulated extraction of human ambition. Reality television provided a framework where ordinary citizens could be lured onto camera, subjected to extreme psychological and physical stress, and compensated with nothing more than the illusion of imminent fame. World Wrestling Entertainment, operating as an absolute monopoly in the sports entertainment sector under the Titan Sports banner, recognized the unprecedented financial utility of this model. The corporation partnered with MTV to engineer Tough Enough. The public marketing framed the program as a grueling but fair athletic combine, an egalitarian search for the next generational superstar. The internal corporate reality was vastly different. Tough Enough was a highly sophisticated recruitment mechanism designed to bypass traditional hardened wrestling territories and harvest compliant, unconditioned talent directly from the civilian sector. Completely disregarding extensive backgrounds in collegiate wrestling, martial arts, or structural physical conditioning, the casting department prioritized strict demographic marketability. They sought individuals who possessed a specific aesthetic malleability, candidates who looked spectacular on a television screen but lacked the deeply ingrained protective instincts of veteran performers. Among the thousands of audition tapes submitted to the Stamford, Connecticut headquarters was one from a 25-year-old middle school teacher named Maven Huffman. Huffman was a 6th grade educator residing in Oregon. His civilian life was anchored by the modest security of public sector employment. He possessed state-mandated health insurance, a predictable salary, union representation, and a retirement trajectory. He also possessed a lifelong, deeply ingrained psychological attachment to the spectacle of professional wrestling. The corporate casting directors immediately identified him as the optimal raw material. He was articulate, naturally charismatic, and possessed a lean athletic baseline. Crucially, he was entirely ignorant of the brutal, unwritten economics of the industry he idolized. He was selected for the inaugural cast of Tough Enough, effectively trading the legal protections of the American public education system for the predatory environment of corporate sports entertainment. The transition from civilian to corporate asset was codified the moment Huffman signed the entry contract. The documents binding the Tough Enough cast members to the production were masterclasses in corporate liability deflection. The foundational trap of the entire professional wrestling industry is the legal classification of the independent contractor. By categorizing performers under this specific legal loophole, the multi-billion-dollar entertainment conglomerate successfully bypasses the fundamental obligations of a standard employer. When Huffman signed his name, he voluntarily surrendered his right to comprehensive corporate health care. He surrendered access to dental coverage, 401k, matching, and standard workplace safety guarantees. He was not protected by the Screen Actors Guild, despite performing in a scripted television show broadcast to millions of homes globally. The contract established a unilateral transfer of physical risk. If a lighting rig collapsed or a maneuver was executed improperly, resulting in a shattered femur or a compressed cervical spine, the financial burden of the surgical repair and the subsequent physical rehabilitation fell entirely upon the individual performer. The corporation secured absolute ownership of the television ratings, the merchandising rights, and the international broadcast capital, while the independent contractor was reduced to a self-repairing biological tool. If the tool broke and could not finance its own repair, the corporation simply terminated the agreement and reached into the developmental pipeline for a replacement. The reality television environment temporarily masked this brutal legal architecture. During the 13-week production of Tough Enough, Huffman and his fellow competitors operated within a highly controlled, heavily supervised bubble. The presence of MTV cameras and mainstream production crews ensured a baseline level of artificial safety. The physical training was grueling, designed to extract visible exhaustion and dramatic friction for the television audience, but it was regulated. Huffman endured the basic concussive impacts, learned the rudimentary mechanics of falling onto a wooden canvas, and consistently delivered the necessary emotional beats required by the producers. He survived the artificial attrition process and was declared the male winner of the inaugural season. Confetti dropped. Executives shook his hand on live television. He was handed a guaranteed main roster contract. The reality television narrative concluded with the realization of the ultimate American dream. Then, the MTV cameras stopped rolling. The protective barrier of reality television was immediately dismantled, and Huffman was plunged directly into the main roster locker room. The WWE locker room in late 2001 was not a standard corporate workspace. It was a deeply paranoid, hyper-competitive autocracy governed by veteran performers who viewed reality television recruits with absolute hostility. For decades, the industry standard demanded that rookies spend years traveling through unregulated, low-paying independent circuits, sleeping in cars, and physically breaking their bodies to pay their dues. Huffman had bypassed this entire brutal initiation sequence via a television show. To the veterans, he was a corporate interloper, an untalented aesthetic prop handed a lucrative position while legitimate battle-hardened wrestlers were denied employment. The corporate hierarchy actively encouraged this hostility. Management utilized the veteran locker room as a decentralized enforcement arm to break the autonomy of new recruits. Rather than building camaraderie, the initiation process functioned strictly as a psychological conditioning program engineered to enforce absolute submission to the corporate structure. Huffman was immediately subjected to relentless, systematic hazing. This extended far beyond standard workplace intimidation. The conditioning required the complete degradation of his personal dignity. The unwritten rules of survival dictated that the rookie must accept any assigned humiliation without a single vocalized complaint. Huffman was assigned the role of an indentured servant to the veterans. He was required to finance their late-night food and alcohol tabs at hotel bars on his entry-level salary. He was responsible for carrying their heavy luggage through international airports. He was banished from utilizing the standard locker room dressing areas, forced to change into his ring gear in public hallways or broom closets. The physical enforcement of this hierarchy occurred inside the ring. During untelevised live events, veterans took deliberate liberties with his physical safety. Standard choreographed strikes were replaced with legitimate, unprotected blows. Maneuvers were executed with excessive force, driving the breath from his lungs and rattling his skull against the canvas. He was subjected to a physical phenomenon known within the industry as being stretched, a process where a veteran utilizes legitimate amateur wrestling. Submission holds to hyperextend joints and apply agonizing pressure, pushing the rookie to the absolute threshold of structural damage. The psychological objective of this systematic abuse was clear. The rookie had to learn the primary currency of the WWE ecosystem: silence. If Huffman complained to management about the physical liberties being taken, he would be labeled a liability and ostracized permanently, virtually guaranteeing his immediate termination. If he retaliated physically against a protected veteran, he would be fired for insubordination. The only acceptable response was to absorb the pain, express gratitude for the opportunity to share the ring with a veteran, and return the next night to do it again. This process successfully recalibrated his psychological baseline. The middle school teacher who once relied on a union representative to negotiate fair working conditions was systematically dismantled. In his place, the corporation manufactured a compliant, isolated independent contractor who accepted physical trauma and public humiliation as standard occupational hazards. The system had successfully installed the initial programming. He had learned to endure the abuse without question. He was now fully prepared to enter the operational phase of the machine, where the violence transitioned from locker room initiation to nightly, standardized bodily destruction. The psychological dismantling of the reality television Recruit was merely the preparatory phase. Once the corporate hierarchy had successfully installed the prerequisite submissiveness, the worker was authorized to enter the primary mechanism of extraction, the physical performance. The global marketing apparatus of World Wrestling Entertainment relies on a fundamental linguistic deception. They utilize the term sports entertainment. This calculated rebranding successfully convinces the general public that because the interpersonal conflicts are scripted and the match outcomes are predetermined by the executive boardroom, the physical violence is entirely simulated. The public perception views the product as an acrobatic illusion. The anatomical reality, however, is governed by physics. Gravity cannot be negotiated with, and it does not recognize a corporate script. The physical environment that Maven Huffman entered on a nightly basis was an industrial hazard zone, entirely devoid of standard occupational safety regulations. The central apparatus of this environment is the wrestling ring itself. The television cameras, utilizing wide angles and bright stadium lighting, present the ring as a spring-loaded, forgiving surface. The structural engineering of the ring tells a different story. It is constructed upon a heavy steel frame. Spanning this frame are thick, reinforced wooden planks, typically oak or dense plywood. Over the wood lies a minimal layer of high-density closed-cell foam, covered tightly by a canvas mat. The primary physical requirement of the independent contractor is the execution of a bump, the act of falling flat onto this surface to simulate the impact of a combat strike. When a performer executes a bump, they are dropping 200 pounds of human mass from a height of 4 to 6 feet directly onto solid wood. The human musculoskeletal system is not biologically engineered to repeatedly absorb this specific type of blunt force trauma. When the back strikes the canvas, the kinetic energy does not dissipate harmlessly. It travels as a concussive shock wave directly through the spinal column. The vertebrae compress. The discs situated between the vertebrae, designed to act as natural shock absorbers, are violently flattened. The impact echoes upward, snapping the cervical spine and rattling the brain inside the skull. A single perfectly executed bump causes microscopic tearing in the muscle tissue and low-grade neurological disruption. The corporate touring schedule demanded that performers absorb this impact not once, but continuously. By late 2001, as Huffman was fully integrated into the live event circuit, the company operated on a relentless schedule. A mid-level performer was expected to wrestle upwards of 200 to 250 nights a year. The mathematics of this physical attrition are staggering. Huffman was subjecting his central nervous system to the equivalent of a low-speed automobile collision every single night. There was no medical off-season. There were no mandated recovery periods. The independent contractor was expected to absorb the deceleration trauma, ice the swelling in the locker room, sleep in a rented vehicle, and replicate the physical trauma in a different city the following evening. The localized trauma of standard maneuvers was merely the baseline. The early 2000s marked the immediate aftermath of the industry's Attitude Era, a period of explosive financial growth driven by extreme visual violence. The audience demographic had been conditioned to demand escalating levels of brutality. Standard wrestling holds were no longer sufficient to maintain television ratings. The booking committee compensated for this by introducing foreign objects into the standard match choreography. The most ubiquitous of these objects was the steel folding chair. The commentary desks consistently sold the illusion that professional wrestlers possessed superhuman endurance, allowing them to casually survive a steel chair striking their skull. The backstage reality was a terrifying compromise between artificial safety and genuine neurological damage. The aluminum chairs utilized by the production crew were intentionally weakened at the hinges. The objective was for the metal to bend upon impact, distributing the force and creating a spectacular visual and auditory effect for the live crowd. However, the physical mass of the metal still connected directly with the human cranium. Striking a performer in the head with a weakened aluminum chair does not eliminate the transfer of kinetic energy. It merely reduces the immediate risk of a lethal skull fracture. The brain still violently impacts the interior wall of the skull upon connection. Every chair shot Huffman witnessed, delivered, or received contributed to a silent, compounding neurological deficit. The accumulation of massive localized physical trauma requires a biological response. When a human body sustains microfractures in the vertebrae, severe bruising of the internal organs, and the systematic tearing of muscle fibers, The central nervous system transmits high-frequency pain signals. The organic physiological mandate is immediate cessation of movement. The body demands horizontal rest, localized icing, and weeks of uninhibited cellular repair. The economic architecture of the professional wrestling monopoly explicitly prohibits this biological requirement. The independent contractor cannot take a sick day. A missed television taping equates to a forfeiture of a coveted roster spot, an immediate loss of income, and the rapid deployment of a replacement from the developmental pipeline. The corporate touring schedule dictates that the performer must absorb the physical destruction on a Sunday night in one state and appear completely functional the following Monday afternoon in another. To bridge the terrifying gap between catastrophic physical damage and the corporate demand for athletic performance, the system necessitates chemical intervention. The precise mechanical failure that triggered this pharmacological descent occurred less than a year into his integration on the main roster. During a routine televised broadcast, the physical disparity between his abbreviated reality television training and the live-action velocity of veteran performers resulted in a catastrophic miscalculation. Huffman severely shattered his fibula. In a regulated, legitimate athletic organization, a severe lower extremity fracture mandates immediate surgical intervention, the insertion of titanium rods and screws, and a strict, heavily monitored 6 to 9 month non-weight-bearing rehabilitation protocol. The WWE ecosystem, however, operates on a ruthless, rapid depreciation schedule. The momentum generated by his Tough Enough victory was categorized as a highly perishable commercial commodity. The executive booking committee implicitly demanded an accelerated return. Huffman was forced back onto the active touring roster long before the bone tissue had properly fused around the newly implanted surgical hardware. Every time he launched himself from the top turnbuckle or absorbed a concussive bump on the unyielding wooden canvas, the metal screws and plates ground directly into the unhealed nerve endings of his leg. The pain was blinding, paralyzing, and completely incompatible with sustained athletic performance. This was the exact documented inception point of his severe narcotic dependency. The corporation essentially forced a human being to perform high-impact stunt work on a shattered, surgically bolted leg, making the daily ingestion of massive quantities of hydrocodone and oxycodone not a recreational indulgence, but a strict, non-negotiable occupational requirement simply to execute his contracted duties. A shadow ecosystem of pharmaceutical dependency was not an accidental byproduct of the WWE locker room. It was the foundational pillar sustaining the entire television product. The corporation manufactured a grueling, unyielding environment, and the performers were forced to synthesize their own survival. This survival depended upon a precise, highly dangerous pharmacological protocol consisting of 4 distinct chemical pillars. The first pillar was aesthetic. The executive boardroom operated on a strict visual mandate. The corporate algorithm determined that audience retention relied on the presentation of superhuman, hypertrophic physical specimens. Maven Huffman entered the system as a lean, athletically conditioned schoolteacher. That civilian physique was entirely insufficient for the main roster. The system demanded massive vascular muscle growth that could not be achieved through natural caloric surplus and standard weightlifting, especially while enduring a cardiovascularly exhausting 300-day travel schedule. The locker room solution was the immediate introduction of anabolic steroids. The acquisition of these compounds was not a covert, back-alley transaction. The industry utilized a network of licensed medical professionals, frequently referred to internally as mark doctors, who compromised their Hippocratic oaths in exchange for backstage passes, signed memorabilia, and proximity to television stars. These physicians supplied human-grade synthetic testosterone, decadurabolin, and human growth hormone directly to the performers. The chemicals forced the body into an unnatural state of constant protein synthesis, rapidly inflating the muscle tissue to satisfy the visual requirements of the executives. The biological cost was severe. The synthetic hormones shut down the body's natural endocrine system. They drastically elevated blood pressure, increased low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, and began the silent, lethal process of thickening the ventricular walls of the heart. The corporation harvested the visual spectacle of these chemically altered bodies, entirely insulating themselves from the inevitable cardiac arrest that would decimate the roster years later. The second pillar of the ecosystem was pain management. As the physical trauma documented in the previous years accumulated, the daily reality for Huffman and his peers became one of agonizing, restrictive pain. A torn rotator cuff, a ruptured spinal disc, or a severely sprained knee could not be surgically repaired because the recovery timeline would terminate their corporate utility. The performers had to override their own nervous systems. They turned to heavy prescription-grade narcotics. Vicodin, Percocet, and OxyContin became the standard currency of the traveling roster. Bypassing any pursuit of recreational euphoria, these narcotics were ingested strictly to achieve a state of functional numbness. The opioids bound to the receptors in the brain and spinal cord, chemically blocking the transmission of pain signals and allowing the performer to lace up their boots and walk to the ring. Alongside the opioids, the locker room heavily relied on chorizo-prodol, commercially known as Soma. Soma is a highly potent muscle relaxant that forcefully interrupts the communication between nerves in the central nervous system and the brain. When a performer's back seized into excruciating spasms, after falling on a steel chair, Soma artificially forced the muscles to unbind. The combination of synthetic opioids and heavy muscle relaxants created a lethal respiratory depression risk, but it provided the necessary chemical shield to survive the nightly concussive impacts. The third pillar addressed the neurological impossibility of the touring schedule. A performer completes a high-stakes television main event at 11 o'clock at night. They have just absorbed massive physical trauma in front of 20,000 screaming fans. Their adrenal glands have flooded their bloodstream with epinephrine and cortisol. The heart rate is highly elevated. By midnight, they are sitting in the passenger seat of a rented sedan, staring at a 300-mile drive to the next arena. Organic sleep is biologically impossible in this hyper-aroused state. However, the system demands that they be conscious and physically active by the following morning. The solution was the chemical deceleration of the central nervous system. Performers ingested massive doses of prescription sedatives and hypnotics, primarily Ambien, Halcion, or benzodiazepines like Xanax. These chemicals forcefully depress the central nervous system, effectively inducing a localized coma while sitting upright in a moving vehicle. The danger of cross-tolerance and chemical interaction was absolute. Mixing lingering opioids, active muscle relaxants, and heavy sedatives creates a volatile biochemical environment where the brain simply forgets to signal the lungs to inhale. Performers routinely monitored their traveling partners, listening to ensure they had not chemically asphyxiated in the passenger seat while hurtling down interstate highways in the dead of night. The fourth and final pillar of the daily protocol was the ignition sequence. After a few hours of chemically induced unconsciousness, the performer arrived at the next hotel or arena. Their body was battered, their muscles were heavily relaxed from the soma, and their cognitive function was severely depressed from the Ambien. The television product, however, required high-energy, explosive athletic performance. The performers utilized central nervous system stimulants to violently shock their bodies out of the sedative hangover. Ephedrine, heavy doses of caffeine, prescription amphetamines like Adderall, and occasionally illicit stimulants were ingested to artificially elevate the heart rate and force the nervous system back online. This daily pharmacological cycle, steroids to build the aesthetic, narcotics to numb the trauma, sedatives to force the shutdown, and stimulants to violently restart the engine, placed an unimaginable tearing strain on the cardiovascular system. The heart was constantly being artificially accelerated and forcefully depressed. It was a biological engine redlining constantly, without oil, driven entirely by the desperate need to maintain the independent contractor status. The highest levels of the Titan Sports corporate hierarchy were not ignorant of this chemical reality. The physical transformations were visually obvious. The glazed eyes and slurred speech in the backstage hallways were impossible to ignore. Yet the systemic response was a masterclass in corporate hypocrisy and liability management. To satisfy public shareholders and deflect media scrutiny, the corporation operated an internal wellness policy or standard drug testing protocol. The public-facing narrative insisted that the company vigorously monitored the health of its athletes. The internal enforcement of this policy was entirely dictated by the financial utility of the performer. The drug testing apparatus functioned primarily as an intelligence-gathering tool for the boardroom, not a medical intervention program. When a highly profitable performer or a reality television investment like Huffman tested positive for massive quantities of unprescribed Vicodin, dangerously elevated testosterone ratios, or heavy sedatives, the corporate response was not an immediate medical suspension. A suspension would disrupt the carefully plotted television storylines and impact live event ticket sales. Instead, the positive test triggered a quiet administrative reprimand in a closed-door executive office. The performer was typically issued a financial fine, an idiot tax easily paid off by their television earnings. Instead of demanding entry into a detoxification facility, management merely issued a cold warning regarding public discretion. They were instructed to manage their intake to avoid creating a public relations liability and, crucially, to not make a habit of it. The executives acknowledged the chemical dependency, collected the fine to establish a paper trail of corporate discipline, and immediately sent the chemically altered performer back through the curtain to generate more revenue. The system required the addiction to function. A sober performer is a biological entity that feels pain, demands rest, and eventually refuses to destroy their own body for a television rating. A functional addict is entirely compliant. The dependency on the locker room economy, the need for the paycheck to fund the shadow pharmacies, and the terror of physical withdrawal ensured absolute loyalty to the touring schedule. The systemic oversight effectively created an environment where illicit pharmaceutical acquisition became an operational standard, utilizing the independent contractor loophole to completely insulate the boardroom from the legal and biological fallout. Maven Huffman, the former public school teacher, had been seamlessly integrated into this biochemical machinery. The corporation had successfully molded him into a self-medicating, pain-absorbing asset, extracting every possible ounce of television value while his internal physiological architecture quietly and inevitably began to collapse. The corporate algorithm eventually determines that the cost of maintenance exceeds the value of extraction. By the summer of 2005, the variables surrounding Maven Huffman had fundamentally shifted. He had fulfilled his initial demographic utility. The novelty of the Tough Enough reality television victory had evaporated, replaced by the standardized grind of the mid-card roster. The cumulative physical toll of absorbing nightly concussive impacts had visibly slowed his athletic velocity. He was no longer a pristine, highly marketable asset. He was depreciating inventory requiring constant chemical maintenance to function. The corporate termination was executed with clinical, administrative efficiency. There was no grand narrative conclusion. A brief communication from the Talent Relations Department invoked the standard budgetary constraints clause, immediately severing the contract. In a fraction of a second, the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure that had dictated every aspect of his existence for 4 years simply vanished. The brutal reality of the independent contractor classification materialized in full force. There was no exit interview. There was no severance package to bridge the financial gap. Crucially, there was no medical offboarding. The corporation did not conduct an MRI to assess the structural damage his cervical spine had absorbed from hundreds of steel chair shots. They did not provide a transition program or a medically supervised detoxification protocol for the severe chemical dependency they had actively subsidized and required for his nightly performance. The machine simply deactivated his security clearance, ejected him from the corporate ecosystem, and deposited him back into the civilian world. He was left possessing a fractured musculoskeletal system, an artificially engineered reliance on high-potency narcotics, and a complete absence of the massive television income required to manage both. This physical torture was simultaneously compounded by a masterful corporate financial illusion. The viewing public, and frequently the reality television recruits themselves, operated under the assumption that a performer featured prominently on Monday Night Raw was accumulating massive generational wealth. The forensic reality of Huffman's ledger was terrifying. He was operating on an entry-level developmental downside guarantee, a baseline salary that barely exceeded the compensation of his former public school teaching position. Crucially, the independent contractor legal classification actively cannibalized this income. The corporation did not subsidize the exorbitant logistical costs of the 300-day travel schedule. Huffman was required to personally finance every cross-country flight, every rental vehicle, and every hotel room out of his own gross earnings. Furthermore, The corporation deliberately withheld basic financial guidance. As a 1099 contractor, he was entirely responsible for self-calculating and remitting his own federal and state taxes. Like the vast majority of young, financially illiterate athletes fed into the corporate machine, the invisible compounding burden of self-employment tax acted as a silent financial hemorrhage. By the time he settled his logistical travel debts, paid the Internal Revenue Service, and funded the increasingly expensive shadow pharmacy required to numb his unhealed fibula, his net profit was virtually non-existent. He was a globally recognized television star operating entirely in the financial red, trapped in a cycle of physical destruction that barely yielded a living wage. When the corporate termination notice was finally issued in 2005, the sudden cessation of this meager income stream plunged him into an immediate economic freefall. Stripped of his corporate utility and burdened with a highly aggressive, metabolically entrenched opioid addiction, Huffman was forced to navigate the civilian labor market. The transition was a brutal public demotion. Without a specialized corporate resume, the former television star migrated to New York City and secured employment within the unregulated hyper-nocturnal ecosystem of the nightlife industry. He became a nightclub bouncer. The juxtaposition of his former and current status was a masterpiece of industrial cruelty. The man who had famously drop-kicked The Undertaker out of the Royal Rumble in front of 50,000 screaming fans, a specific highlight actively monetized by WWE on pay-per-view replays and DVD compilations worldwide, was now standing on a freezing Manhattan sidewalk, checking identification cards and absorbing the verbal abuse of intoxicated patrons for a stagnant hourly wage. The psychological humiliation of this role was relentless. Nightclub patrons consistently recognized him, initiating highly degrading interactions, demanding to know why a famous wrestler was standing in the rain guarding a door. To survive this intense psychological degradation and to manage the chronic pain of standing on concrete for 10 hours a shift on a surgically compromised leg, his chemical dependency scaled exponentially. Furthermore, the nightclub environment was the absolute most toxic geographical location for a man suffering from severe addiction. Operating in the dark, cash-heavy periphery of the city's nightlife provided him with direct, unmitigated access to the pharmaceutical underworld. The corporate machine had shattered his leg, initiated his addiction, legally starved him of his wealth through predatory contracting, and then discarded him into an environment perfectly engineered to accelerate his chemical demise. The 2012 arrest was not an unpredictable anomaly. It was the flawless mathematical conclusion of his transition from a disposable corporate asset to a marginalized, chemically dependent security guard. To combat the agonizing physical pain of his ruined joints, the body demanded its chemical shield. Inside the heavily insulated WWE locker room, acquiring narcotics was a streamlined, institutionalized process facilitated by compliant physicians and shared resources. In the civilian sector, Huffman was entirely isolated. The abrupt cessation of his main roster income collided violently with an escalating biological tolerance for synthetic opioids. The human body rapidly adapts to the presence of narcotics. The dosage that initially provided total functional numbness quickly becomes the baseline requirement simply to avoid the debilitating, violently physical sickness of opioid withdrawal. Without the locker room infrastructure, Huffman's dependency scaled to horrifying proportions. The illusion of the functional addict shattered. He was no longer using the medication to perform athletic stunts. He was using it to survive standard human existence. He later admitted under the cold scrutiny of public confession to ingesting up to 20 heavy-duty painkillers in a single instance. This specific volume of narcotic intake is highly lethal to an unconditioned human being. It triggers massive respiratory depression, forcing the central nervous system to stop signaling the lungs to inhale. For Huffman, it was merely the required dosage to achieve basic physiological equilibrium. It was the necessary chemical fuel to force a severely traumatized, heavily addicted body out of bed each morning. Securing this massive volume of controlled substances outside of the corporate wrestling bubble required a full-time, highly illegal logistical operation. The addiction hijacked his remaining executive function, redirecting all cognitive effort toward the acquisition of the chemical. He entered the perilous medical underworld of Florida, a state infamous during that specific era for its largely unregulated pain management clinics. Huffman engaged in the systematic, desperate practice of doctor shopping. Operating far beyond standard narcotics trafficking, this specific felony requires the meticulous, highly calculated manipulation of the medical infrastructure. Huffman was forced to visit multiple physicians across different counties. He fabricated localized pain symptoms, concealed his previous medical diagnoses, and utilized a sprawling network of distinct pharmacies to fill overlapping prescriptions. It was a complex choreography of deception, driven not by a desire for criminal profit, but by the absolute terror of biological withdrawal. He was a physiological hostage desperately trying to feed a chemical requirement engineered by his former employer. Records later indicated that between early March and early April of 2012, this desperate logistical network acquired over 1,000 high-potency controlled pills. The mathematics of doctor shopping inevitably trigger law enforcement algorithms. State medical databases eventually cross-reference the overlapping prescriptions and flag the unusual, massive volume of narcotics linked to a single identity. On April 2nd, 2012, the Florida law enforcement apparatus executed the arrest. The reality television star, the man who had defeated some of the biggest names in the wrestling industry on global pay-per-view broadcasts, was processed through the state criminal justice system. The resulting mugshot, a stark, unedited, clinically lit photograph of a visibly exhausted, physically diminished man, was immediately injected into the global media ecosystem. The visual contrast was jarring and deeply tragic. The audience remembered the grinning athletic rookie showered in confetti on MTV, holding the guaranteed contract. The police database presented the hollowed-out remnants of a corporate extraction process. The reaction from the professional wrestling monopoly was immediate, calculated, and entirely predictable. The corporate public relations machine executed a flawless disavowal. They distanced themselves entirely from the arrest. The official corporate narrative, echoed implicitly by affiliated media, framed Huffman as a rogue element. He was presented as a tragic but isolated case of a minor celebrity succumbing to the pressures of fame and making poor personal choices. The company did not acknowledge the 4 years he spent absorbing undocumented concussions on their unpadded canvases. They did not mention the internal locker room culture that implicitly required him to ingest painkillers to fulfill his grueling contractual obligations. They ignored the fact that their independent contractor loophole allowed them to extract millions of dollars from his physical performance and discard him without providing a single day of medical rehabilitation for the damage they had monetized. The corporation simply pointed to the mugshot, washed their hands of the liability, and continued broadcasting their flagship programs to millions of viewers. They left Maven Huffman to face the severe legal penalties and the terrifying biological consequences of a corporate business model entirely alone. The system had successfully transferred the total cost of its violence onto the victim, preparing the legal and public narrative for the final, brutal realization of the industry's true nature. The mugshot of a fallen television star is rarely analyzed as a corporate receipt. It is instinctively categorized by the public as a moral failing, a predictable narrative of sudden wealth and subsequent personal decay. This is precisely the narrative the sports entertainment monopoly relies upon to maintain its structural immunity. When Maven Huffman was processed through the Florida justice system in 2012, Huffman's chemical dependency was the direct biological inheritance of a highly calculated corporate philosophy perfected by Titan Sports. The system consistently prioritized rapid content generation over human longevity, utilizing performers as expendable biological capital. The industry's true history is documented within the redacted medical files and premature autopsies of its workforce. It lures candidates with the promise of unprecedented social elevation, utilizing reality television vehicles like Tough Enough to harvest untrained compliant bodies. It subjects these bodies to a scientifically unendurable regimen of localized, blunt force trauma. When the human nervous system inevitably rebels against the daily concussive impacts, the corporate structure implicitly mandates the use of highly addictive synthetic narcotics and black market steroids to maintain the required aesthetic and functional output. The corporation harvests the maximum capital from this chemically sustained performance, all while hiding behind a highly publicized, fundamentally hypocritical internal wellness policy. Eventually, the mathematics of human biology assert themselves. The cartilage deteriorates. The neural pathways scar. The physical velocity slows. The moment the algorithmic value of the performer drops below the cost of their weekly television appearance, the corporate guillotine falls. The machine severs the contract with total clinical detachment. The performer is violently ejected from the highly structured, adrenaline-fueled reality of global television and abandoned in the civilian sector. They are left holding the full tab for a body ruined in the service of a billionaire's portfolio, equipped with nothing but a severe chemically engineered opioid dependency and the creeping silent neurological decay of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The profound tragedy of Maven Huffman lies not in breaking the rules of the corporate ecosystem, but in following them with absolute devastating perfection. He accepted the reality television casting. He endured the locker room hazing. He signed away his basic labor rights. He took the bumps on the exposed wood. He utilized the required pharmacology to ensure he never missed a booked appearance. He surrendered his physical and psychological autonomy to the machine, trusting the corporate illusion that loyalty and sacrifice would be rewarded with long-term security. He was punished because he outlived his utility. Transcending the mere sale of athletic competition or scripted drama, the industry operates a highly lucrative business explicitly built on monetizing the actual, unrecoverable health of its labor force. The stadium lights, the pyrotechnics, and the global broadcasting rights are entirely subsidized by the shattered spines, the enlarged hearts, and the fractured minds of the men and women who step through the curtain. When the lights eventually power down, the corporation remains pristine, its profit margins insulated from the carnage. The discarded performers are left to navigate the wreckage alone, their ruined bodies standing as the silent, permanent collateral damage of an entertainment monopoly that consumes human life by design.